The Empire State Building, Central Park, the Statue of Liberty. These are just some of the New York City attractions that millions of visitors flock to each year. In 2019, before the years-long tourism downturn caused by the pandemic, the East Coast hub welcomed more than 66 million people. The Big Apple is commonly referred to as the center of the universe. It's a must-see destination that's chock full of iconic history, culture, entertainment, and remarkable eats. Throughout the centuries, the city has been the point of entry for hundreds of millions of immigrants who've reached the shores of the U.S. in search of a better life. Go back to the mid-19th century after the end of the Civil War, and this growth from small city to large metropolis was taking off as waves of immigrants flowed into the hub, forcing an expansion of its borders.
It was always a city that welcomed immigrants, but as they were coming over, they were forced to live in a very crowded area because there was a little bit of development north of, say, 14th Street, but most people were south of 14th Street. And it wasn't until after the Civil War, essentially, in the mid-1800s, that the city started to develop further north.
That's Laurie Lewis, a writer and editor who's lived in New York City for almost 40 years. Lewis is a longtime New York City tour guide and the owner of Take a Walk New York Tours, which specializes in private walking tours of the city. She's also the author of the book New York City Firsts: Big Apple Innovations That Changed the Nation and the World. For years, she's been uncovering the many achievements stemming from New York, one of these being the advent of taller, larger buildings, constructed with a more modern and effective design and better materials like cast iron and steel. Take the Chrysler Building, for instance, which opened in 1930. Lewis says at its base, the structure is wide and boxy, but as you get higher up, it becomes narrower.
You eventually end up with just a small tower on top of this tall box. And as a result, we have the beautiful skyline that we have today. So the Chrysler Building is an example of what happened as a result of that 1916 zoning law. But it's other things as well. It's an Art Deco structure. Art Deco was becoming very popular in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And if you go into the Chrysler Building, even before you enter, you'll notice this beautiful exterior doorway. You go into the lobby and it takes your breath away. It's a masterpiece of using building materials to create an artistic effect, which is part of what Art Deco is. Also, as you look at the Chrysler Building high up, you'll see the hood ornaments that were suggestive of the hood ornaments on Chrysler cars.
But less than a year after the Chrysler Building was finished, the Empire State Building opened its doors. Suddenly, there was a new skyscraper in town that took the title of world's tallest building. It wasn't until 1970 that the Empire State Building relinquished its title as another New York high-rise stepped into its shoes, the World Trade Center. And the towering high-rises aren't the only architectural marvel. The massive bridges spanning the East River connect the people of New York together. Lewis highlights, however, that these nearby landmasses were not always part of the city.
One of the things that all three of the East River crossings achieved, but the Brooklyn Bridge first, because it was the first bridge, Brooklyn at that time was a separate city from New York. And already, because ferry services started early in the century, already Brooklyn had become a suburb of New York. It's called America's first suburb. But when the Brooklyn Bridge opened and then subsequently the Manhattan and the Williamsburg Bridge, these bridges opened, it made it so much easier for people to live in Brooklyn and commute to work in the city. And so the whole suburban development really took off as a result of these bridges.
There are several bridges across the Big Apple, but the most prominent are the Brooklyn, Williamsburg, and Manhattan bridges. If you're visiting New York soon, bike or walk across the scenic Brooklyn or Williamsburg Bridge instead of driving. Each year, hundreds of thousands of tourists snap a picture on the Brooklyn Bridge with its prominent stone towers with pointed arches rising up in the background. The architectural feat took 14 years to build, and finally opened in the summer of 1883.
At the time, it was a revolutionary concept of how do you build a span across a river that's this big and this deep. And so what they had to do in creating the Brooklyn Bridge was to sink caissons into the East River. The construction crew would go down into those caissons and drill until they hit bedrock, which was quite a long drill, quite a long time. So it was a fascinating piece of workmanship, and the result is just a beautiful, beautiful bridge.
And once back on land, another spot that's on many tourists' must-see list is Central Park. The urban abode, created in 1858, is located in the heart of Manhattan and is a rectangle stretching 2.5 miles long and half a mile wide.
The city leaders felt that New York needed a big public park to show that we aren't just a city of commerce. We're not just a city where people work all the time. And we are a city that appreciates beauty and that gives its citizens something. And happily, even as building materials made it possible to build on the land that is now Central Park. I mean, if you go there and just look east or west, you'll see high rises all around you, residential high rises. But the city left the land for a park for which I and most New Yorkers and tourists too are very grateful.
If you're spending an afternoon in Central Park, Lewis recommends stopping at the Bethesda Fountain and then heading north to see the Alice in Wonderland statues near the model boat pond. From there, the north end of the park offers a different environment.
It's a beautiful, more natural feeling area. It was not leveled as much so that you get more hills there than you do elsewhere. And you walk into the woodlands there, and you truly do feel that you have left the city. If you go there early in the morning, if you go either to the North Woods or to the Ramble, which is the woodland in the central part of the park, you will not be alone. There will be tons of bird watchers there. And so it's a safe area because there are other people around.
Whether you're visiting Central Park, touring a museum, or simply just in New York for Broadway or business, the city boasts a vibrant and massive landscape that's quite unlike anything else on Earth. Without the many innovations of early New Yorkers, who knows where the Big Apple would be today? To find out more about this topic and our guest, Laurie Lewis, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also check Lewis's new book, New York City Firsts, available online and in bookstores now. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
There are people that you can reach out to cold and say, hey, I see that you talk about becoming a teacher. I'm thinking about becoming a teacher. Could I get a 15-minute virtual coffee with you? I have some questions I want to ask.
The importance of mentorship. Then,
have been very stagnant, and they've withheld raises as well as just raising base pay.
How workers are standing up and demanding more. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.